After her father's mysterious death, she uncovered a web of lies, betrayal, and secrets that would change her life forever. What would you do if the foundation of your life was ripped out from under you, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and whispers of betrayal? In today's story, a young woman finds herself thrust into a web of lies and family secrets after an unthinkable tragedy. Stay until the end to uncover the shocking truth, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Emma Thompson's world was as ordinary and peaceful as a small-town life could be. Growing up in Lakeview, Oregon, she had a close relationship with her father, Michael, a hard-working businessman known for his integrity and warmth. Their bond was unshakable, forged in the years after her mother's passing. When Michael became both a father and mother to Emma, life took a turn when Michael remarried. Victoria Hawthorne entered their lives like a summer storm, beautiful, magnetic, and utterly unpredictable. With her perfectly styled blonde hair and icy blue eyes, she charmed the town, convincing everyone she was a devoted wife and a caring stepmother. But behind closed doors, Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes, and her kindness toward Emma felt hollow, almost rehearsed. Despite the undercurrents of tension, Emma worked to adjust, especially since her father seemed happy. Michael assured her that Victoria would bring stability to their lives. "Give her a chance, Em," he had said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She's trying." Emma's carefully balanced world came crashing down on a rainy October evening. Her father left for a routine business trip to Seattle, promising to return in 2 days. The rain poured heavily that night, drumming against the windows as Emma studied in her room. She could still hear his voice echoing in her mind, full of warmth and certainty, as he said, "I'll see you soon, kiddo." The following morning, the sound of Victoria's phone ringing shattered the quiet of the house. Emma stood at the top of the staircase, watching as Victoria answered the call. The color drained from her stepmother's face. "I see," Victoria whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. "Thank you for letting me know." She hung up, placed the phone on the counter, and turned to the window, her expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, descending the stairs cautiously. Victoria turned slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Your father's gone, Emma. His car went off the road near a ravine. He didn't survive." The words hit Emma like a freight train. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the cold tile floor. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible. He's careful. He's..." Her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Victoria crouched down, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. The touch was light, almost dismissive. "We have to be strong," she said, her voice flat. "There's a lot to handle now." Michael's funeral was a blur of tears and condolences. The entire town came to pay their respects, each mourner offering platitudes that felt hollow to Emma. She clung to the belief that this was all a terrible mistake, that her father would walk through the door any moment, scolding her for crying over something so absurd. But he didn't. A week after the funeral, Emma began packing up her father's belongings. It was an emotionally grueling task, every item a reminder of the man she had lost. While sorting through his desk, she came across a small, ornate key tucked inside an envelope. The initials TB were engraved on its handle. Emma held it up to the light, her brow furrowing. "What's this for, Dad?" she whispered. But there was no one to answer her question. Later that evening, as Emma sat in her room, turning the key over in her hands, she heard Victoria speaking on the phone. Her voice was low, her tone unusually sharp. "It's done," she said. "Now we can move forward." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She moved quietly to the top of the staircase, straining to hear more. But Victoria ended the call abruptly and walked out of the room, leaving Emma with a growing sense of unease. The next few days were a whirlwind of adjustments. Victoria took full control of the household, her cold demeanor making it clear that she expected obedience. She began selling off Michael's assets, claiming it was necessary to pay off debts Emma had never heard of. "Why are you selling Dad's things?" Emma asked one morning as Victoria boxed up her father's watch collection. "It's none of your concern," Victoria snapped, her eyes flashed with irritation. "Your father left us with responsibilities, Emma. You wouldn't understand." Emma's chest tightened. "But he was so careful with money. This doesn't make sense." Victoria stepped closer, her gaze icy. "You think you know everything about your father. Let me tell you something, little girl. He wasn't as perfect as you thought." Emma retreated to her room, clutching the key tightly. Her mind raced with questions. Why would her father hide this key? What was Victoria hiding? And why did her stepmother seem so unaffected by his death one stormy night? Unable to sleep, Emma returned to her father's study. She searched every drawer and shelf, hoping to find something that would give her a clue about the key's purpose. Her efforts were in vain, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. As lightning illuminated the dark sky outside, Emma made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. She had to. The chapter ends with Emma standing in the middle of her father's study, the mysterious key clutched tightly in her hand. Outside, the storm raged on, a reflection of the turmoil brewing in her heart. The days after Michael's death bled into weeks, each one colder and more isolating than the last. The vibrant home Emma had once known transformed into a shadow of itself. The laughter and warmth her father had brought were replaced by a suffocating silence and Victoria's icy control. Victoria wasted no time reshaping the household in her image. She redecorated, selling off cherished items that reminded Emma of her father. The soft leather armchair where Michael used to read, the painting of mounthood he loved, even his collection of antique clocks all gone, replaced with cold, modern furniture that screamed indifference. "You don't need these things," Victoria said when Emma protested. "We need to move on, and clinging to the past won't help anyone." Emma's protests fell on deaf ears. She tried to reach out to her friends, but Victoria restricted her phone usage and claimed that constant communication would only distract her from healing. It felt more like a prison sentence than a grieving process. Lily, Victoria's daughter from a previous marriage, was no source of comfort. While Emma hoped they could find common ground in their shared grief, Lily quickly revealed herself to be her mother's reflection, dismissive, arrogant, and smug. One afternoon, as Emma sat quietly in the living room, Lily entered, her presence as unwelcome as a cold draft. She glanced at Emma, her lips curling into a smirk, still sulking. "You should try being useful for a change." Emma clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "My father just died, Lily. Have some respect." Lily laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Respect? Your father's gone? Emma, the world doesn't stop because you're sad." Maybe it's time you learned that. Every interaction with Lily and Victoria chipped away at Emma's spirit. She found solace only in her memories of her father and the mysterious key she had found. She kept it hidden, fearing that Victoria might take it away if she discovered it. One evening, as Emma dusted the shelves in her father's study at shore Victoria had assigned her, she noticed a small wooden box she hadn't seen before. Its edges were worn, and the brass clasp looked oddly familiar. Her heart raced as she retrieved the key from her pocket and fit it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the box opened with a soft click. Inside, she found an old photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photo showed her father standing next to a man she didn't recognize. They were both smiling, but something about the man's face felt unsettling. The note was brief but cryptic. "TB can't be trusted. Keep this safe." Emma's hands trembled as she reread the note. What did it mean? Who was TB? And why had her father felt the need to hide this? Before she could process her discovery, the door to the study creaked open. Victoria stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing in here?" Victoria asked, her tone sharp. Emma quickly slipped the photo and note back into the box and closed it. "Just cleaning," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. "Stay out of your father's things. They're no longer your concern." Emma swallowed hard and nodded, clutching the box tightly. As Victoria left, Emma realized something chilling. Victoria hadn't asked about the box or the key. She knew the following days brought more restrictions. Victoria began enforcing a curfew, limiting Emma's time outside the house. The walls felt like they were closing in, and Emma's isolation deepened. Even the neighbors, who had once been warm and friendly, now seemed distant. When she asked about her father, they gave her vague answers and quickly changed the subject. One morning, while Victoria was out running errands, Emma took the opportunity to search for more clues. She combed through every drawer and shelf in the house, but Victoria had been thorough in erasing traces of Michael's life. Defeated, Emma sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the photograph she had retrieved from the wooden box. Who was the man in the picture? Why had her father warned against trusting him? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She quickly hid the photo and note under her mattress as Lily entered, a smug look on her face. "What are you hiding?" Lily asked, her tone dripping with mockery. "Nothing," Emma replied, avoiding her stepsister's gaze. Lily stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room. "You know, Mom says you're going through a rebellious phase. She thinks you're trying to find things that aren't there." Emma bit her lip, her frustration mounting. "Maybe I'm just trying to figure out what really happened to my father." Lily's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of something Emma couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You're wasting your time," Lily said, her voice colder now. "Dad's gone, and nothing you do will bring him back." As Lily left, Emma's determination solidified. She couldn't let Victoria and Lily gaslight her into doubting herself. Her father's death wasn't an accident, and the key was proof of that. That night, as rain pattered against her window, Emma lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities. What if Victoria had orchestrated everything? What if the man in the photo TB was involved? The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Emma spent every waking moment thinking about the photograph and the cryptic note she had found. The initials TB haunted her, a riddle that refused to be solved. Despite Victoria's constant vigilance and Lily's smug remarks, Emma knew she had to keep digging. Late one afternoon, while Victoria was out hosting a charity luncheon, Emma found herself alone in the house. The opportunity was too good to pass up. She returned to the wooden box she had hidden under her bed, carefully retrieving the photograph and note. The man's face stared back at her, his expression frozen in a moment of happiness that now felt unsettling. Emma's heart raced as she turned the photo over, noticing faint writing on the back for the first time. Tacoma Bay, 2016. It read in her father's neat handwriting. Tacoma Bay, the initials matched. Was this the TB her father had warned about? The sound of the front door opening startled her. Emma hurriedly shoved the items back into the box and slid it under her bed just as Lily barged into her room. "What are you up to?" Lily asked, her arms crossed and a suspicious look in her eyes. "Nothing," Emma replied quickly. Lily's gaze lingered on Emma before she shrugged. "Mom wants you downstairs to help with dinner," Emma nodded. Her mind still racing, she needed a plan, and she needed help. That evening, while scrolling through her father's old contact list on her phone, Emma came across the name Harrison with a number attached. Mr. Harrison was an old family friend and one of the few people her father truly trusted. Without thinking, Emma dialed the number. The phone rang several times before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Harrison speaking. Mr. Harrison. It's Emma Thompson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Emma," he said warmly. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" "I'm managing," she replied hesitantly. "I need to ask you something. It's about my dad." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What's going on?" Emma hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I found something, a key, a photograph, and a note. My dad wrote it, and it mentions someone or something called TB. Do you know what that means, Mr.?" Harrison sighed heavily. "Emma, this isn't a conversation we should be having over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow at the diner on Main Street? Let's talk in person." The next day, Emma slipped out of the house while Victoria and Lily were preoccupied with a shopping trip. She arrived at the diner and spotted Mr. Harrison sitting in a corner booth. His weathered face broke into a gentle smile as she approached. "It's good to see you, Emma," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Emma wasted no time. She pulled out the photograph and the note, sliding them across the table. "Do you know what this means, Mr.?" Harrison studied the items carefully, his expression darkening. "I hope this wouldn't resurface," he murmured. "What do you mean?" Emma pressed. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Tacoma Bay wasn't just a place your father visited. It was tied to a business deal, a dangerous one. He didn't want you involved, but he always feared it might come back to haunt the family." Emma's stomach churned. "What kind of business deal?" "Let's just say your father was dealing with people who don't like loose ends," Mr. Harrison replied, his tone grave. "TB was the code name for someone involved. I don't know who, but your father kept this quiet for a reason." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying my dad was killed because of this?" Mr. Harrison hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the diner door opening. Emma glanced over and froze. Victoria had just walked in, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Emma. "Emma," Victoria said, her voice dripping with faux concern, "what are you doing here?" Emma quickly pocketed the photograph and note. "I needed some air," she said, standing up. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Let's go home now." As they drove back in silence, Emma could feel the tension in the air. Victoria knew something was going on, and Emma knew she couldn't let her guard down. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she couldn't shake Mr. Harrison's warning. Her father's death wasn't an accident. and TB was at the center of it all. She had to find out who or what TB was before it was too late. Emma stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities. The photograph, the note, the key, everything felt connected. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it seemed. Somewhere in the house, the sound of soft footsteps echoed in the dark. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was outside her door. The next morning, Emma woke with a start, her heart still pounding from the previous night. The mysterious footsteps outside her door had vanished as quickly as they had come, leaving her restless and on edge. Had it been Victoria, or was her mind playing tricks on her? Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but the atmosphere at the breakfast table was as cold as ever. Victoria sat at the head, scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable. Lily was across from Emma, her lips curled in the faintest smirk. "You're looking pale this morning, Emma," Lily said, her voice saccharine and mocking. "Bad dreams?" Emma ignored her, focusing on her toast. Lily's ability to see through her was unsettling. It felt like her stepsister knew more than she let on, as if she was watching Emma's every move. After breakfast, Victoria called Emma into the study. She was seated behind the desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Emma, we need to talk," Victoria began, her voice calm but firm. "I've noticed some changes in your behavior lately. I understand you're grieving, but I won't tolerate sneaking around or breaking the rules. Do I make myself clear?" Emma nodded stiffly, biting back the urge to challenge her. She knew Victoria's calm demeanor was a mask, and pushing her would only lead to more restrictions, as Emma turned to leave. Victoria added, "And stay away from Mr. Harrison. His involvement with this family ended when your father passed." Emma froze, her blood running cold. How had she known about their meeting? Was she being followed, or was someone spying on her? Upstairs, Emma tried to piece together her next steps. She had to find out more about the photograph and the mysterious TB, but she couldn't do it alone. Mr. Harrison had warned her to be careful, but his cryptic warnings weren't enough. Lily's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You really think you're clever, don't you?" Emma turned to see her stepsister leaning casually against the doorframe. A smug grin on her face. "What are you talking about?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lily stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Oh, come on, Emma. I've seen you sneaking around, looking for whatever it is you think you'll find. But let me give you some advice. You won't like what you uncover." Emma stared at her, her frustration bubbling over. "What do you know, Lily? What are you hiding?" Lily's grin widened, but her eyes held a glint of something darker. "Why should I tell you? Watching you squirm is so much more fun." Emma clenched her fists, her patience wearing thin. "If you know something about Dad's death, you need to tell me." Lily stepped closer, her expression turning cold. "Dad's death was an accident, Emma, just like Mom says. But if you keep digging, you might end up regretting it." Emma's heart raced as Lily left the room, slamming the door behind her. Her words felt like a threat, and for the first time, Emma realized just how deep the hostility between them ran. Later that evening, Emma found herself alone in the study. She sat at her father's desk, running her fingers over the worn wood. Her eyes landed on a drawer she hadn't checked before. It was locked, but the key in her pocket fit perfectly. Inside, she found a stack of old letters, all addressed to her father. They were from someone named Thomas Barker TV. The letters were vague, filled with references to the deal and keeping things quiet. One letter, dated a month before her father's death, stood out. "Michael, we need to finalize everything soon." "Loose ends make me nervous." TB Emma's heart sank as she reread the letter. It was confirmation that TB was a real person and likely connected to her father's death. But who was Thomas Barker, and why was her father dealing with him? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her jump. Emma quickly locked the drawer and slid the key back into her pocket just as Lily entered the room. "Finding anything interesting?" Lily asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Just some old papers," Emma replied, trying to sound casual. Lily raised an eyebrow, her gaze lingering on Emma for a moment before she turned and left. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The tension between her and Lily had reached a boiling point, and the letters only deepened the mystery. She felt like she was on the verge of uncovering something huge, but every step forward seemed to bring new obstacles. As she stared out the window, the moonlight illuminating her face, she made a silent vow. She wouldn't let Victoria or Lily intimidate her. She owed it to her father to find the truth, no matter the cost. The following morning, Emma woke with a sense of purpose. The letters she had found were her first solid lead, and she couldn't afford to waste any time. She needed to know more about Thomas Barker and his connection to her father. As she sat at the breakfast table, pretending to listen to Victoria and Lily's chatter, her mind raced with plans. She decided to visit the library in town, one of the few places Victoria would allow her to go alone. With a stack of books and a laptop, it would be easy to claim she was researching for school. After breakfast, Emma excused herself and headed into town. The library was quiet, its shelves lined with the scent of aged paper and dust. She found a secluded corner and opened her laptop, typing Thomas Barker into the search bar. The results were sparse at first: an obituary for a man with the same name in another state, a few social media profiles that didn't match. But as she dug deeper, she came across an article from a small Tacoma newspaper. The headline read, "Local businessman implicated in fraud scandal." Emma's eyes widened as she clicked on the link. The article was about Thomas Barker, a real estate developer who had been accused of embezzling millions from his clients. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but his reputation had been tarnished. She scrolled through the article, noting every detail. There was a photograph of Barker, an older man with slick-back hair and a confident smile that felt more sinister than reassuring. Emma's stomach churned as she recognized the man from the photograph she had found in her father's box. Her hands trembled as she printed the article, carefully folding it and slipping it into her bag. She needed to confront Mr. Harrison again. He had to know more about Barker and his connection to her father. Back at the house, Emma quietly slipped into her room. Avoiding Victoria and Lily, she opened the box and placed the article alongside the letters. Her collection of clues growing. That evening, Victoria called Emma into the living room. Lily was perched on the couch, a smug grin on her face. Victoria held a glass of wine, her demeanor calm, but her eyes sharp. "Emma," Victoria began, "I've noticed you've been acting secretive lately." Emma's heart pounded. "I'm not sure what you mean." Victoria tilted her head, studying her. "You've been disappearing into town, spending hours away. Is there something you'd like to share with us?" "I've been working on a school project," Emma lied, keeping her voice steady. Lily snorted. "A school project? Sure." Victoria held up a hand, silencing Lily. "If there's something troubling you, Emma, I might suggest you come to me directly. I wouldn't want you to get overwhelmed by things you don't understand. Emma clenched her fists, biting back a retort. She knew Victoria was testing her, trying to intimidate her into revealing what she had discovered. I'll keep that in mind, Emma said, forcing a polite smile. Later that night, Emma texted Mr. Harrison, asking him to meet her the next day. She couldn't risk calling him with Victoria and Lily always nearby. The following afternoon, Emma slipped out of the house under the guise of meeting a classmate. She arrived at the diner, her bag clutched tightly in her hand. Mr. Harrison was already there, a cup of coffee in front of him. "Emma," he said, his voice filled with concern, "what's going on?" Emma pulled out the article and the letters, spreading them on the table. "It's him," she said, her voice trembling. "Thomas Barker. He's the TB in my dad's letters." Mr. Harrison's face darkened as he scanned the documents. "I was afraid of this," he muttered. "What do you mean?" Emma asked. "Your father got involved with Barker years ago, before you were born," Mr. Harrison explained. "Barker was running a fraudulent real estate scheme. And your father was brought in as an investor." When Michael realized what was happening, he tried to back out, but Barker didn't take it well. "He threatened to ruin your father's career, his life, everything." Emma's breath caught. "And my father kept this from me. He didn't want you to know, Mr. Harrison said gently. He thought he could handle it. "But Barker is dangerous. Emma, your father was afraid of what he might do." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as the pieces began to fall into place. "Do you think Barker had something to do with my dad's death?" Mr. Harrison hesitated. "It's possible. But if Barker is involved, you need to be very careful. He's not someone you want to cross." As Emma left the diner, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She clutched the article and letters tightly, determined to uncover the truth no matter the danger. That evening, as Emma entered the house, she noticed something odd. The door to her room was slightly ajar. Inside, her things were scattered, drawers pulled open, the contents of her desk strewn across the floor. Her heart sank as she realized the wooden box was gone. Emma's chest tightened as she stared at the mess in her room. Someone had been looking for something and they had taken the box. Her mind raced, the realization hitting her hard. Victoria. It had to be her. She must have discovered Emma's clues and stolen the box to keep her silent. Tears of frustration pricked Emma's eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. If anything, this confirmed she was getting closer to the truth. Close enough for Victoria to feel threatened. The next morning, Emma found herself wandering through the park near her house, trying to think of her next move. The crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks as she paced along the winding paths. She was startled when a voice broke through her thoughts. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Emma turned to see Ethan, the quiet boy who lived 2 houses down. He was leaning casually against a tree, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. Emma barely knew him. He kept to himself and rarely spoke, but there was something about his easy demeanor that made her pause. "I've just had a lot on my mind," Emma said cautiously. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his sharp blue eyes studying her. "You've been on edge for weeks. Whatever it is, you're not hiding it well." Emma hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. "It's complicated," she said finally. Ethan shrugged. "Complicated's my specialty." There was something disarming about his honesty. Against her better judgment, Emma found herself telling Ethan about the box, the letters, and her suspicions about her father's death. She left out the finer details like the name Thomas Barker but gave him enough to understand the danger she was in. When she finished, Ethan whistled low. "That's heavy," he said. "But if you think Victoria's involved, you're going to need help." "She's not exactly the type to roll over and admit guilt," Emma frowned. "Why would you want to help me?" Ethan smirked. "Let's just say I'm not Victoria's biggest fan. My mom used to work for her." And let's just say it didn't end well. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. Emma didn't press him for details, but felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Ethan could be the ally she needed. Over the next few days, Ethan and Emma worked together to piece together what little evidence they had left. They combed through old newspapers, searching for anything that might connect Victoria to Thomas Barker. Ethan, who had a knack for digging into hidden corners of the internet, found a connection between Barker's fraud scandal and a series of properties in Oregon, including one owned by Victoria. "This can't be a coincidence," Ethan said, pointing to the screen. "Your dad must have known about this." Emma's stomach churned. If her father had been trying to expose Barker and Victoria, had they silenced him to protect themselves? As their investigation deepened, Ethan became a constant presence in Emma's life. His humor and quick wit provided a rare source of comfort in her otherwise tense existence. But there were moments when Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan wasn't telling her everything. One evening, as they pored over records in the library, Emma noticed Ethan stiffen when she mentioned Barker's name. "Do you know something you're not telling me?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I didn't want to drag you into this, but my mom didn't just work for Victoria. She worked for Barker too. He's the reason we moved here." She was trying to get away from him. Emma's eyes widened. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I didn't think it mattered," Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. "But the more I hear about what's happening to you, the more I think it's all connected. My mom always said Barker had people everywhere. If Victoria's working with him, she's probably just one piece of the puzzle." Emma's trust in Ethan wavered. But she couldn't afford to lose his help. They were running out of time. That night, Emma returned home to find Victoria waiting for her in the living room. The box was on the coffee table, its contents neatly arranged. "We need to talk," Victoria said, her tone eerily calm. Emma's pulse quickened. She sat down across from Victoria, her eyes darting to the box. "I know you've been looking into your father's business," Victoria began. "And I know you've been talking to people you shouldn't, but let me make one thing clear. Whatever you think you've found, it won't change anything." Emma clenched her fists. "You're lying. You and Barker had something to do with Dad's death." "I know it." Victoria's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're just a child, Emma. You have no idea how the world works. Your father made choices, and he paid the price. That's all there is to it." Emma's voice shook with anger. "If you think you can scare me into stopping, you're wrong. I'm going to find out the truth." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emma. Be careful you don't end up like your father." As Emma retreated to her room, her mind reeled from the encounter. Victoria's threat was clear, but it only strengthened Emma's resolve. She couldn't back down now. In the dead of night, Ethan texted her, "Found something big. Meet me tomorrow." Emma could barely sleep after receiving Ethan's message. She lay awake, staring at her phone, wondering what he could have uncovered. Whatever it was, she knew it would bring her closer to the truth, but the weight of Victoria's warning hung heavily on her mind. The next morning, she slipped out of the house before Victoria or Lily could stop her. The air was cold and crisp, the kind of chill that promised winter was near. She met Ethan at their usual spot in the park, where he was pacing anxiously, clutching a folder. "You're not going to believe this," Ethan said, his voice low. "What did you find?" Emma asked, her nerves tightening. Ethan handed her the folder. Inside were printouts of property records, financial documents, and a photograph that made Emma's blood run cold. It was a picture of Victoria and Thomas Barker, standing arm in arm in front of a luxury estate. "She lied," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "She told me she barely knew him. She didn't just know him," Ethan said, pointing to the documents. "She was working with him. This property. It's under both their names. Your father must have found out and confronted them." Emma's hands shook as she flipped through the papers. The pieces were starting to fit together. Her father's death, Victoria's hostility, Barker's connection to the fraud, it all led back to the property. "We need to get inside that house," Ethan said, his voice firm. Emma's eyes widened. "What? That's insane. We can't just break into someone's property." Ethan smirked. "It's not breaking in if you have the key." He pulled a set of old keys from his pocket. "My mom used to clean that place. She kept these as insurance." Emma hesitated. The thought of trespassing terrified her, but the chance to uncover the truth was too important to pass up. That night, under the cover of darkness, Emma and Ethan drove to the estate. The house was massive, its stone facade looming against the night sky. It looked abandoned, but the eerie silence only made it feel more menacing. "Are you sure about this?" Emma whispered as Ethan unlocked the gate. "Not at all," Ethan replied with a grin, pushing the gate open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the faint moonlight streaming through the windows gave the place an otherworldly glow. Emma and Ethan split up to search the house. Emma's heart pounded as she explored the upstairs rooms, each one more lavish than the last. In one room, she found a desk covered in papers. Most were innocuous old bills, receipts, but one envelope caught her eye. It was addressed to Barker, and inside was a letter detailing the financial arrangement he had with Victoria. The letter revealed that Barker had been laundering money through the estate and using Victoria as a front to keep his name clean. Emma's stomach turned as she read the final line. "If Michael becomes a problem, take care of it. We can't afford loose ends." Emma clutched the letter, her mind racing. It was confirmation that her father's death hadn't been an accident, it had been orchestrated. A noise from downstairs broke her concentration. Emma froze, straining to hear. It sounded like footsteps. "Ethan." She called out softly, but there was no response. Her pulse quickened as she crept down the stairs. Clutching the letter tightly, in the dim light, she saw a shadow move across the hallway. She backed into a corner, her breath shallow. The shadow grew larger until Victoria stepped into view, her face twisted in anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Victoria hissed. Emma's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "I know everything. I know about Barker, the fraud, and how you killed my father." Victoria's laugh was cold and sharp. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Your father was a fool. He couldn't let go of his morals, and it cost him everything." Emma's hands trembled as she held up the letter. "I'm taking this to the police. You won't get away with this." Victoria's expression darkened. You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with. Emma, Barker has connections everywhere. You think the police will protect you. You're just a naive little girl. Before Emma could respond, Ethan appeared behind Victoria, holding a heavy candlestick. I think it's time you left, he said, his voice steady. Victoria turned, her eyes narrowing. And who are you supposed to be? Her knight in shining armor. Ethan didn't answer. He stepped closer, forcing Victoria to back away. Let's go. Emma, he said, motioning for her to follow. They fled the house, the letter clutched tightly in Emma's hand. As they drove away, Emma's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had the evidence she needed to expose Victoria and Barker, but Victoria's warning echoed in her mind. Barker had connections. If she went to the police, would they even listen? Or would she be putting herself in more danger? Emma could barely sleep after receiving Ethan's message. She lay awake, staring at her phone, wondering what he could have uncovered. Whatever it was, she knew it would bring her closer to the truth. But the weight of Victoria's warning hung heavily on her mind. The next morning, she slipped out of the house before Victoria or Lily could stop her. The air was cold and crisp, the kind of chill that promised winter was near. She met Ethan at their usual spot in the park, where he was pacing anxiously. Clutching a folder, "You're not going to believe this," Ethan said, his voice low. "What did you find?" Emma asked, her nerves tightening. Ethan handed her the folder. Inside were printouts of property records, financial documents, and a photograph that made Emma's blood run cold. It was a picture of Victoria and Thomas Barker, standing arm in arm in front of a luxury estate. "She lied," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "She told me she barely knew him. She didn't just know him," Ethan said, pointing to the documents. "She was working with him. This property. It's under both their names. Your father must have found out and confronted them." Emma's hands shook as she flipped through the papers. The pieces were starting to fit together. Her father's death, Victoria's hostility, Barker's connection to the fraud, it all led back to the property. "We need to get inside that house," Ethan said, his voice firm. Emma's eyes widened. "What? That's insane." "We can't just break into someone's property," Ethan smirked. "It's not breaking in if you have the key." He pulled a set of old keys from his pocket. "My mom used to clean that place. She kept these as insurance." Emma hesitated. The thought of trespassing terrified her, but the chance to uncover the truth was too important to pass up that night under the cover of darkness. Emma and Ethan drove to the estate. The house was massive, its stone facade looming against the night sky. It looked abandoned, but the eerie silence only made it feel more menacing. "Are you sure about this?" Emma whispered as Ethan unlocked the gate. "Not at all," Ethan replied with a grin. Pushing the gate open, inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the faint moonlight streaming through the windows gave the place an otherworldly glow. Emma and Ethan split up to search the house. Emma's heart pounded as she explored the upstairs rooms, each one more lavish than the last. In one room, she found a desk covered in papers. Most were innocuous old bills, receipts, but one envelope caught her eye. It was addressed to Barker, and inside was a letter detailing the financial arrangement he had with Victoria. The letter revealed that Barker had been laundering money through the estate and using Victoria as a front to keep his name clean. Emma's stomach turned as she read the final line. "If Michael becomes a problem, take care of it." "We can't afford loose ends." Emma clutched the letter, her mind racing. It was confirmation that her father's death hadn't been an accident, it had been orchestrated. A noise from downstairs broke her concentration. Emma froze, straining to hear. It sounded like footsteps. Ethan. She called out softly, but there was no response. Her pulse quickened as she crept down the stairs, clutching the letter tightly. In the dim light, she saw a shadow move across the hallway. She backed into a corner, her breath shallow. The shadow grew larger until Victoria stepped into view, her face twisted in anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Victoria hissed. Emma's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "I know everything. I know about Barker, the fraud, and how you killed my father." Victoria's laugh was cold and sharp. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Your father was a fool. He couldn't let go of his morals, and it cost him everything." Emma's hands trembled as she held up the letter. "I'm taking this to the police. You won't get away with this." Victoria's expression darkened. "You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with. Emma, Barker has connections everywhere. You think the police will protect you? You're just a naive little girl." Before Emma could respond, Ethan appeared behind Victoria, holding a heavy candlestick. "I think it's time you left," he said, his voice steady. Victoria turned, her eyes narrowing. "And who are you supposed to be?" Her knight in shining armor. Ethan didn't answer. He stepped closer, forcing Victoria to back away. "Let's go, Emma," he said, motioning for her to follow. They fled the house, the letter clutched tightly in Emma's hand. As they drove away, Emma's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had the evidence she needed to expose Victoria and Barker. But Victoria's warning echoed in her mind. Barker had connections. If she went to the police, would they even listen? Or would she be putting herself in more danger? Chapter 8. The family confrontation. The tension in the house was unbearable when Emma returned. She had barely spoken a word to Ethan after their escape from the estate. The letter she carried felt heavier with every step, as if it held not just the weight of her father's death, but the future of her entire life. Inside, Victoria and Lily were waiting for her in the living room. Victoria's expression was as cold as stone, but there was a flicker of something new in her eyes, fear. Lily, on the other hand, looked smug, her arms crossed as if she had been waiting to deliver a verdict. "Where were you?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp and demanding. Emma took a deep breath, holding her ground. "I went to see the truth for myself. And I found it." She placed the letter on the table between them, her hands trembling. "You lied about everything." Victoria's face didn't change, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. She picked up the letter and scanned it quickly, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly Emma thought it might tear. "This is nonsense," she said, her voice low but venomous. "It's not nonsense," Emma shot back. "You and Barker used my father. When he tried to stop you, you had him killed." "This proves it." Lily laughed, a harsh and mocking sound. "Oh, please, you think anyone's going to believe you? You're just a kid playing detective." Emma turned to her stepsister, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. "Why do you always defend her, Lily? You know she's lying, or are you part of it too?" Lily's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by something Emma couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps. "I don't owe you any explanations," Lily snapped, her voice rising. "You've always acted like you're better than me. Like this family is yours and I'm just some outsider." "Well, guess what, Emma? Maybe you're the outsider now. Enough." Victoria's voice cut through the air like a whip. She threw the letter onto the table and stood, towering over Emma. You think you're so clever, don't you? Digging into things you don't understand. Putting your nose where it doesn't belong. Emma refused to back down. I understand enough to know you're a murderer. Victoria's expression turned icy, but her voice softened, almost eerily calm. You don't understand anything, Emma. Your father wasn't the saint you think he was. He made choices, bad ones. And those choices had consequences. Emma's chest tightened. What are you talking about? Victoria took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. Do you really think your father was some innocent victim? He was involved with Barker long before I came into the picture. He was up to his neck in it. The only difference is that I knew how to survive. And he didn't. Emma's world tilted. Could it be true? Had her father been part of Barker's schemes willingly? She shook her head, refusing to believe it. You're lying. You're just trying to twist the truth to save yourself. Victoria leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. Believe what you want. Emma, but if you take that letter to the police, you won't just be putting me at risk. You'll be exposing your father too. His name will be dragged through the mud, his legacy destroyed. Is that what you want? Emma's resolve wavered. The thought of her father's name being tarnished, of the town turning against him, made her stomach churn, but she couldn't let Victoria manipulate her. She had to focus on what was right, no matter how painful. I'm not scared of you, Emma said, her voice firm. And I'm not going to let you get away with this. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You should be scared, Emma. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Before Emma could respond, Lily stepped forward. Mom, stop, she said, her voice shaky. Both Emma and Victoria turned to look at her, surprised by the sudden shift. This has gone too far, Lily continued. You can't keep lying to her. She deserves to know the truth. Victoria's face darkened. Lily, don't you dare. She's right, Lily interrupted, her voice gaining strength. Dad didn't want any of this. He tried to protect us, but you wouldn't let him. You forced him into Barker's schemes, and when he tried to pull out, you enough. Victoria's voice cracked, and for the first time, Emma saw fear in her stepmother's eyes. Emma's breath caught as Lily's words sank in. You knew, she said, her voice trembling. You knew all along, and you didn't say anything. Lily looked at Emma, tears welling in her eyes. I was scared. Mom said Barker would come after us if I talked. I didn't know what to do. Emma felt a mix of rage and heartbreak. You could have told me. We could have stopped this together. Lily looked away. Unable to meet Emma's gaze, the room was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Victoria, usually so composed, looked rattled, her mask of control slipping. This isn't over, Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma stood her ground, her heart pounding. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The next morning, Emma woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The confrontation with Victoria and Lily had solidified her resolve, no matter how painful the truth. She owed it to her father and to herself to expose what had been done. She sat at her desk, carefully organizing the evidence she had gathered. The letters, the property records, the damning photograph, and the note linking Barker to her father's death were all laid out in front of her, each piece fit together like a dark, twisted puzzle. Before she left the house, Emma made one final stop in her father's study. She stood in the center of the room, her gaze falling on the empty chair where he had once sat. "I'll make this right, Dad," she whispered. Emma walked out the door, her bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't tell Ethan where she was going. This was something she had to do alone. The drive to the police station felt longer than it should have, each mile weighed down by the gravity of what she was about to do. Inside the station, the air was sterile and tense. A middle-aged officer with kind eyes approached her. "Can I help you?" Emma nodded, her voice steady. "I need to report a crime." "It's about my father's death." The next few hours passed in a blur. She laid out everything for the detectives: the evidence, the timeline, and her suspicions about Barker and Victoria. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious as she explained the connection between Barker's fraudulent schemes and her father's attempts to break away. When she finished, one of the detectives leaned forward. "This is a lot to process, Emma," he said. "But what you brought us is significant. We're going to open an investigation." Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with apprehension. Would they be able to hold Barker accountable? And what about Victoria? As Emma left the station, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. "Something's going on." "Meet me at the park." Emma hurried to their usual spot, her heart pounding. Ethan was waiting for her, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" she asked. Ethan handed her his phone, where a news article was open. The headline read, "Businessman Thomas Barker found dead in suspected suicide." Emma's knees buckled, and Ethan steadied her. "What? How?" she stammered. "It just broke an hour ago," Ethan said. "Looks like Barker took the easy way out. Maybe he knew the walls were closing in." Emma's mind raced. Barker's death meant the investigation might hit a dead end, but it also meant she was finally free of the looming threat he had posed. Later that evening, Emma returned home. Victoria was sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say a word as Emma entered, but the tension between them was palpable. "I went to the police," Emma said, her voice calm but firm. "They know everything." Victoria's eyes flickered with something Emma hadn't seen before. "Defeat. You've ruined us," she said quietly. "No," Emma replied, her voice steady. "You ruined yourself. And you ruined my father." Lily appeared in the doorway. Her expression conflicted. She stepped into the room, glancing between Emma and Victoria. "What happens now?" she asked. Emma looked at her stepsister, her voice softening. "That depends on you. You can keep covering for her, or you can do the right thing." Lily hesitated, then nodded. "I'll tell the truth. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Victoria was arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. The community was shocked, and whispers of the scandal spread like wildfire. For Emma, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had uncovered the truth and honored her father's memory, but the cost had been high. Her family was shattered, and the scars of betrayal would take time to heal. On a quiet afternoon, Emma sat by the lake where she and her father used to go fishing. She held the photograph of him, her fingers tracing his smile. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emma felt a sense of peace. The future was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: she had the strength to face whatever came next. And for the first time in months, she smiled.